I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 114th episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. This week we're going to have what we might consider a little bit of a meta episode, where we're not talking about any particular smart drug or compound, but instead a new online service built to help answer the question of what smart drugs or compounds you might actually want to be taking in the first place. We're going to be talking with the CEO of a new company called Modern Alchemy. His name is Garrett Ruhland, and that will be the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, in a strange riff following on last week's episode, where we talked about how high bandwidth internet pornography might be altering people's brains, I've got some information on an interesting study that's not porn related, but is just internet related in general, but equally shocking, especially for those of us that haven't been kids in a couple of decades, about just how much modern kids do seem to be affected by the internet. A really interesting study that'll be in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick. But now, as usual, let's kick things off first with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So one thing that humans seem to be pretty bad at but endlessly fascinated by are really big numbers and really small numbers. And I guess it kind of makes sense that these things are fascinating because we don't have an intuitive grasp on them the way that we do of, let's say, 1 to 20, the numbers of fingers and toes that the average person has. It is said, I'm not sure if this is apocryphal or not, this might not be true, that there are some native cultures where their counting systems have essentially 4 numbers, 1, 2, 3, and many. And many is used to delineate anything over the number 3. That seems a bit, I don't know if I believe that on the face of it. I would want to see that pretty well documented. But either way, when you start trying to visualize things like millions and billions, I think we can all acknowledge that that's not a number that one can call to mind in a meaningful way. So maybe it shouldn't be surprising when there's a radical revision in the estimate of just how much information a human brain can hold. There has recently been such a recalculation by Terry Sanowski of the Salk Institute for Biological Sciences in La Jolla, California, who has gone on record in saying that the brain can hold as much as 1 petabyte of data, which is in the same ballpark as the entire World Wide Web. Now, what is a petabyte? Well, to answer that question, first of all, you need to know what a quadrillion is. A quadrillion is a 1 followed by 15 zeros. And then you also want to know what a byte is. For those of you that are computer geeks, a byte is a collection of 8 binary digits, also known as bits. When people talk about bits, that is a cute abbreviation of binary digit. A binary digit would just be a 1 or a 0. There's no other options. But with a combination of 8 ones and zeros, you can actually hold 256 different permutations of that. So 1 byte can define up to 256 separate states. So take 256, multiply that by 1 quadrillion, and that's how many distinct yes-no pieces of information are stored in a petabyte. So how did Terry Sanowski come up with this number? Well, he took a small cube of rat brain tissue and he looked at it under an electron microscope, and he and other scientists painstakingly recreated a 3D reconstruction of the hippocampal cells looking at the connections among those neurons. While it's traditionally been thought that synapses, the connections between one brain cell and the next, can come in 3 different sizes, creatively referred to as small, medium, and large, it now looks like there are actually many more distinctions and as many as 26 different varieties, with each synapse on average being able to hold the equivalent of 4.7 bits, binary digits of information. So 4.7 bits per synapse times the number of synapses that they found in this cube of rat brain, multiplying that up to the size of a human brain and the density of neural cells within a human brain, and that is where you get 1 petabyte, which is a completely gargantuan number. Now, that being said, I'm not sure how much this analogy holds, because in my limited understanding, synapses are made to convey information in a transitory way, kind of akin to the RAM in a computer, used for working processing rather than long-term storage, more like the hard drive of a computer. So I'm not sure if equating synapses with storage capacity is really an accurate analogy, but either way, even if the analogy might be a little bit hinky, gives us, I think, an appropriate measure of respect for the work that people are doing when they're talking about trying to emulate a human brain in something like whole brain emulation, and seeing just what a Herculean task that really is.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast where smart people talk about smart drugs.
Picked up a couple more 5-star reviews on iTunes this week. Balaban MD says, after losing over 160 pounds and achieving optimal health for my body, I was looking for resources to optimize and improve my cognitive performance. This podcast will be one of the top podcasts I listen to every week. I strongly recommend this to everyone. And Carlito474 says, Thank you, Jesse, for bringing Gary Wilson on the show to talk in depth about an incredibly prevalent and relevant, wow, that's a tongue twister, problem in our culture and across multiple age groups. This is referring to last week's episode on internet porn. Keep up all the much needed work. I'm happy to donate financially on the website every month to this great work you do. So thank you very much to both of you and to everybody that is leaving reviews on those other international wings of iTunes and Stitcher and things like that I don't quite check every week, but I know that you're leaving reviews too, and I really appreciate that as well. Carlito474 just mentioned the fact that we actually did turn on a donate link on smartdrugsmarts.com if you feel like dropping a couple dollars here and there to help make the podcast happen. That is hugely appreciated. We actually put that link together because a couple of people had asked specifically, hey, how do I donate? We didn't really have an answer for them up till that point, but now we do. We've got a donate page. You can donate with credit card or PayPal or any of those ways that one typically makes web payments. And of course, if you're feeling like doing something a little less overtly philanthropic, but still want to help Smart Drug Smarts, you could take a visit over to axonlabs.io, where we've got a couple of supplement stacks. You've heard me talk about them before, and you will certainly hear me talking about them again. Nexus and Mitogen, our cognitive and physical stacks. Not exactly accurate doing a full-on brain-body division like that, since we all know that the brain and the body are intricately interwoven. And in fact, actually, not to skitter off the topic too much, but we're putting together an episode on the brain and the immune system and how those two interact. Hope that you're all feeling healthy out there and avoiding seasonal viruses. But in the meantime, if you could use a couple of extra mitochondria floating around, check out Mitogen over at axonlabs.io. Includes something called PQQ, which promotes the growth of more mitochondria within your body, as well as a host of other good stuff. If you want to help direct the future of Smart Drug Smarts in some fairly special ways, there's going to be a link to a little questionnaire that we're putting together in this week's edition of our newsletter, The Brain Breakfast. Maybe next week as well. We'll do a double up. But if you're not on that newsletter list already, head on over and do get signed up. That is at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. It's maybe a light 5-minute read every week, kind of keeps you up to date on what we're thinking about, ruminations on past, present, and future episode topics. And then if you feel like digging deeper, there's a lot of links off to other places on the web that might have interesting things related to cognitive performance. If you're too busy to read it some week, just click delete, no hard feelings, but we'll do our best to keep it loaded up with good stuff for you. That's smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So, as mentioned, this week we're going to be speaking with Garrett Ruhland, who comes from a science background, but as you will hear is very much on the business end of the cognitive enhancement world. He's somebody that I actually had recommended from a couple of different directions from past guests on this show. I think actually a total of 3 people, and there's that old rule that once is random, twice is a coincidence, and 3 times is a pattern. Well, by the time it got to the 3rd time, there was no excuse but to set up an interview. Garrett is the CEO of an internet-based startup company called Modern Alchemy. Alchemy is spelled in a little bit of a funky way, ALKAME. Not surprisingly, we will put a link on the website if you want to check that out. But they've got a couple of really interesting services that they're going to be offering. What caught my eye particularly was the ability for their customers to put together a pretty low-effort, placebo-controlled study of their own response to various nootropic compounds. We'll be talking with him about that, about the setup of their business, their ability to integrate with a lot of different biometric trackers that are out there on the market, and some of the new features that they're planning to roll out over the course of the next year. So now let's jump in with Garrett Ruhland.
I went to Duke, and I majored in neurochemistry there. And like most students, when they go to a school like that, they're pre-med. It really was what I was actually going to do. And I had gotten into medical school, and I was going to defer for a year because, when I was there, I had a lot of friends that went on to start different companies. And I said, you know what, I'm in. I'm going to defer for 1 year. I'll give the startup world a try. I'll go back to it if I don't like it. What ended up happening was I stepped foot into the startup world and fell in love with it. And it just so happened that I crossed paths with TrueBrain when they were first coming out with their product line. And the CEO, Chris Thompson, he was a Duke Fuqua business grad. So we actually hit it off, and I kind of saw what he was doing, and I saw that he really actually needed a lot more guidance from the science side. In neurochem, nootropics are something that it's heavily talked about, but it's not something that you've seen in the mass market yet. And so I was incredibly excited about the fact that things that we actually see from the academic world were being implemented for sale, and people were actually actively using them for work in the real world. I stuck with that, and that's kind of what led to this transition where I started off as a biohacker and a nootropic researcher, and then ended up actually implementing that for real world value. Going into nootropics from the service side really came from my experience working on the product side. My background is in neurochemistry. Working at the last company I was at with TrueBrain, they have a phenomenal product line, and it was helping them develop Think Drinks, the liquid nootropic. And working with Dr. Andrew Hill, it was a phenomenal experience. But I noticed that there was an enormous kind of missing gap in this industry, and that was every time I dealt with customers, or I would even talk with other academics on nootropics, how they function, pros and cons of consumers taking them, there was always the question that would say, what else do people take with nootropics? And customers would always ask, what else can I take my existing kind of stack with? And there's nowhere that people can really go to get that answer. You can't go to a doctor, really, because your physician doesn't know that much about nootropics or cognitive enhancement. Unless someone has a degree in medicine or a PhD in neuroscience, trying to really understand the literature is very difficult. So what we're trying to do with Modern Alchemy is we're trying to assemble a team that really has a background in medical diagnostics and academic research, and we're trying to apply that in a way that the consumer who actually wants to take nootropics is taking them in the most educated fashion possible.
So what's that team look like? How are you building out that staff?
The staff initially was exclusively all doctors. Of course, there was my co-founder and I who have worked in the industry, so we knew what we were getting ourselves into. The hardest part was actually recruiting the doctors because we had to tell them, first of all, what nootropics are. And whenever you're trying to tell a doctor that hasn't heard of nootropics before kind of what they do, they get very scared because we're looking at compounds that in many cases mirror pharmaceutical products, but they're not regulated. That was something that we actually had to show them the research, and then they got incredibly excited about it and saw that this is something it's an industry that's going to be growing tremendously. So we built with a medical team, and then we started to build from that, acquiring the technical expertise to actually implement some of the techniques we wanted done through our service.
There's always sort of going to be that push and pull between what the recommended combinations of some of these different chemicals are for the everyman and then really person-specific based on a person's genetics, a person's diet, a person's even environmental factors. How are you trying to split that difference?
That's actually what's led us to the initial service we're going to be launching this month with Modern Alchemy. So like I said, when Modern Alchemy first started, we recruited a lot of doctors. The way it worked was customers would actually come to us. They would provide us with an entire electronic health record, and we'd go through and we'd actually assess what we thought was the best way of starting for a certain stack. And then we'd follow up with not the patient, but the customer on a consistent basis, actually seeing how they were performing and then making changes. Now, what we ended up realizing was this wasn't really that scalable, number one. And number two, we were facing some of the same issues that existing, medical practitioners face. And that's the fact that the majority of the information that we need is not readily available to us. Customers will not tell us when they were feeling most anxious, what time of day it was, really how they were sleeping. We ended up actually going to the flip side. What we ended up doing was we had these team of doctors, and then we said, we need a lot more information to make this worthwhile. And so that's when we brought on the technical expertise, and we built this app. And what we've done with our app is it essentially aggregates data from any source you can imagine. We have over 90% of the wearable devices on the market integrated. We're going to be pulling, a lot of personality insights from users, social media accounts down to just behavioral tracking. And then what we ended up realizing was we developed an app that's so good at aggregating data that we still haven't addressed the core problem, which was how do we know what people should take to start off with? That's kind of what led us with Modern Alchemy to this new service we're providing, which is going to be called the Double Blind. What we're essentially doing with this is we just created a combination of very commonly used stacks. We provide users essentially the structure to take these stacks in a similar fashion that you would see a double blind conducted. So a user actually will go through a 4-week process where each day they're actually going to be taking packets that are not marked. It's just going to be marked for the day. And they're going to record how they're feeling. And then at the end of this essential trial, the customer is going to actually submit what their unique ID was, and we'll reveal to them what were the nootropics that they actually took over the course of this study. And of course, they're going to know a combination of possible nootropics. What that will allow us to actually discover is really how these nootropics are affecting consumers, because there's going to be placebos in this mix as well. Customers are going to discover not only what works for them, but their research is actually going to provide us with sufficient data to develop the first predictive model for nootropic recommendations.
I imagine that a person's diet also is going to play in with that, and there are other lifestyle factors, whether they're exercising, men or women, things like that. Tracking whether somebody's a man or a woman, that's pretty easy. That's a one click and it's not going to change. But things like dietary factors will change day to day and might have some interplay with the nootropic compounds that they're taking. Are you taking something like that into account?
Absolutely. So that really was the second half before we got to this half of actually obtaining research. It was data aggregation. You have to be conscious as a developer to know how consumers may not want to actually manually input information every day. It gets tiresome. It gets weary. If you're not directly benefiting from typing something in, it gets hard to do. So what we've done is we know we've integrated with existing systems. For instance, like Fitbit and HealthKit. MyFitnessPal is an excellent source that a lot of people commonly use. So being able to get access to this information and have it submitted into our service without the user having to do much allows us to obtain some of this information that you wouldn't readily, have. The other benefit is when a user first creates their profile, we go over the basics such as allergies, medications they're currently taking, and any significant clinical interactions. So we're able to start developing this system where we have so much information that we can actively use and in cross-referencing the effects of these nootropics because, diet plays a significant factor with cognition.
So really, the more people you can get using this, the more accuracy that it'll get. You'll probably have a better product in 2017 than you do in 2016, just by virtue of having a year's worth of data under your belt by that point.
Exactly. And the great thing is that our customers actually benefit from it because it's obviously a machine learning platform. And the more data that the customer actually submits for their profile, the more precise we can tailor these recommendations where it's looking like by mid-December of 2016, and that's a very specific date. We're trying to do it before 2017. Customers are actually going to be able to get real-time recommendations where we can differentiate whether they're exercising or actually in a stress-induced state and recommend nootropics for them to take in real time.
So that's to say, like, if you're watching their Fitbit and you see that this person's heart rate is just shot up by 30%, you think you'll have enough data by then to know whether they're on a treadmill or whether their boss just said something like your job is in jeopardy?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's cross-referencing a great deal of things. We're going to have, there's going to be access to calendars, so we'll know when a user actually, if they have a meeting during that period of time, we'll be able to actually develop behavioral patterns where we know if the user is in fact exercising, if they are in fact at home, if they're actually working, and then being able to kind of cross-reference a lot of that information to see if what the indicators are for a stress-induced kind of state for the customer, and then being able to provide recommendations from that.
I mean, I guess you're really drinking data through existing platforms, things like Fitbit or Jawbone or whatever. But in the process of setting all this up, were there any interesting legal things you came across? Like, is this a service that will be strictly for U.S. customers to begin with, or is this equally available in other parts of the world?
We've done a lot to actually get the tech completed. However, the real difficulty lies in the legal landscape. A customer being able to provide this personal information for their own improvement is one thing, but we do end up crossing some essential lines where you have to realize that some of this information is personal medical information. We have to be in accordance with HIPAA compliance, and we aren't treating customers for diseases. We're not here to diagnose anybody. So we're working with essentially a team of attorneys to really see what the legal landscape's looking like with cognitive enhancement in general, in combination with actually wearables and the data they provide. And once we actually have that sorted out, we're going to be slowly releasing new services with our app that have taken that into account.
What's your own personal stack like?
The problem with stacks is that sometimes someone finds a stack and they say, this is the stack, this is it, but they're not stagnant. What you need day to day actually might change based on different variables. So my stack definitely changes based on the amount of hours of sleep I've gotten the night before. It changes based on the type of exercises I've performed over the course of that week or the different types of activities or stressors I've experienced. But I do have a core stack with the foundational nootropics or, just general compounds of the omegas, DHA specifically. I'm personally a huge fan of adaptogens, given, their plethora of benefits. And then I have quite a unique combination of different racetams and cholinergics that I switch in and out. What's really great is there's so many different individuals here that have different experiences that seeing their journey inside the team with nootropics it's always fun to watch because we have our neuroscience team and essentially all of us have taken every nootropic on the map. But a lot of even our developers and our business dev guys, they'll come in and they'll say, I've never tried nootropics before. And we'll start them off with a certain stack and 3 months go by, 6 months go by, and seeing how they've experimented with different options and they're falling in love with actually trying out and testing. It's just a great testament to how you need a different combination based on the type of person that you are, but how different combinations always have a different effects based on the person that's taking them.
Yeah. So if somebody's listening to this interview now, this will be early February when this comes out, what might they be able people to expect, let's say in like the coming 2, 3, 4 months?
What we've done with Modern Alchemy is the first thing we're going to be releasing in the next few weeks. We're calling it the Nootropic Starter Kit. It's going to be a 4-week process. So the users are going to take 3 very commonly used blends, and 1 week will be a placebo blend. But it's essentially a double-blind service. And what this is going to be is it's going to empower users to actually conduct their own take-home double-blind assessment. And Modern Alchemy will simply provide them with the platform, the tools to conduct it at home. So a customer will actually be able to take a stack of nootropics and then over the course of a few weeks actually discover through the same steps that you would do in a double-blind what nootropics work best for them. So we're actually helping customers break through their own cognitive bias and kind of help deal with the placebo effect to find out what nootropics they shouldn't take. That should be done in the next few weeks. And we've partnered with an existing nootropic company, Nootropic City. We found that one of the things with especially even this double-blind service is you want to be able to control every variable possible. And what we've done is we've partnered with an existing company that essentially they've exhibited excellent quality control. We can actually source the nootropics from where they're actually manufactured down to whoever is actually getting them. So for when we're doing a double-blind study for the customer, we can actually tell them essentially every variable involved down from the products that they're taking, where they were actually created. And we're going to have our basic app up, and it's going to be a web app, and that will be up and running for the customers to actually use in combination with this service. So a customer will be able to order this nootropic kit, and they'll receive the email notification letting them know what nootropics they're going to expect in this box. But we're not going to tell them obviously what dates and what packets are which. And through the actual app, they'll be able to actually log in and record how they're feeling every day. So at the end, they submit their results, and they'll actually be able to have the ability to export all their data for their own research if they like. But we'll present to them really a visualization of what weeks and what days were best and actually tell them which nootropics were the one. And, it could be the case that the weeks that they performed the best were placebo weeks. And that's something that we're really hoping just to discover and help our customers do. And then in about 2 months, we'll actually have the ability to double blind any combination where a customer can actually go into our marketplace. They can pick and choose different nootropics, and they can actually just choose the option to double blind it, in which case we'll take those nootropics, we'll pack them in unmarked paquettes, and actually guide them through the entire process so they can actually pick their own stack and do a double blind of the stack they're taking and actually find out what specific agents are working for them versus what they actually think are working.
That'll be a lot of fun. This will be a fun process for people.
The difficulty is it's conducting the double blind. I mean, you're already breaking it if you know what you're buying and what paquettes you're taking. So it's being able to guide our customers through that. And it's also, we want to address the fact that there's so much research available upon how these nootropics work, but there still is not enough. We still need more information on really what's working for what type of individual, and we want to get those variables so we can help the biohackers out there that want to improve. Because at the end of the day, if a pharmaceutical company is not paying for this research or an academic institution is not getting the grant money to make it happen, this is the type of information that would not be available. And we're trying to really kind of help customers learn how academic research is done and help them apply those principles in their day-to-day life.
Yeah, and I mean, the skew of so much of the academic research data is towards particularly old people and people that are starting to suffer with oncoming dementia or Alzheimer's. And it makes sense why those are the studies that get the funding, but there's a lot of people that don't necessarily fit those profiles that are still interested in some of these chemicals and the potential benefits.
Exactly. So, what happens if you are a healthy guy or girl and you're working and you want to improve and you don't want to compromise your cardiovascular health from taking too much Adderall or, an actual pharmaceutical, what do? And they don't know. So being able to actually really break down and say, look, there's thousands of products on the market. Let's find what you think you want to take and really see if it works. The most important thing that's needed for the nootropic industry right now is data. It's actually predicting how these compounds work together. It's predicting how they're going to work for a consumer. So that's really what we're doing. The exciting thing about Modern Alchemy is we're not manufacturing or producing nootropics. We pretty much just want to go to our customers and say, there's a lot of companies out there that have great products. Let's just see which ones work best for you based on what your body's telling us, not based on kind of what you're being sold.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very, very much to Garrett Ruhland for taking the time to walk us through what they've got going on over at Modern Alchemy. I think the ability to fairly effortlessly tie in biometric tracking data from different devices with how we're feeling on a certain day, with what our nootropic stacks might be, that kind of stuff is really exciting. We're certainly in the era of big data now, and it's really interesting to think about how huge quantities of publicly sourced data might be able to kind of revolutionize the way studies are done. In a way, you've got a lot less experimental control than you do under traditional lab experiment sort of settings. But you can do these kinds of studies on data that you acquire at scale, probably for a much lower cost per data point. So if you can find a way of being as rigorous as possible in cleaning up the data as best you can, getting rid of confounding factors and such, we should be getting into a really exciting time of being able to make reasonable inferences about a lot of things that we would have just had to be pure speculation previously. And companies that are working to take advantage of some of this aggregated data, like what Modern Alchemy is doing, I think are going to be a giant part of that. As Garrett mentioned, there's some sorts of studies that are worth doing, but there's not a whole lot of financial incentive for the people that normally finance studies to actually do. But as promised now, let's move along to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Katerina Morosheva is a child psychologist, and she thought it would be interesting to see what would happen if modern teenagers, these are kids between 12 and 18 years of age, voluntarily spent 8 hours alone and without access to any means of communication, no mobile phones, no internet, etc. Just to kind of see how they could handle it. They were also forbidden to turn on their computer, any electronic gadgets, the radio, or the TV. They were allowed to engage in old-fashioned activities the kids might have traditionally done while alone, reading, writing, playing musical instruments, painting, singing, etc., etc. Now, if this experiment didn't have interesting results, we wouldn't even be talking about it now. So you might assume right off the bat that modern kids don't necessarily handle this sorts of situations so well. And while that's true, the results are even more shocking than one might expect. Now, the only caveat that I want to put here is I couldn't find out how she actually got her 68 participants in this study. Being that she's a child psychologist, I wonder if it's a randomly selected population sample or if these are kids that already know a child psychologist for some reason and therefore maybe are a little bit more likely to have some sort of psychological issue. I don't know. It doesn't go into that. But either way, 68 participants. The challenge was to just spend 8 hours by themselves without access to direct human-to-human interaction or communication technologies, technological entertainment like TVs and iPads, stuff like that. The short answer is the kids did horrible. Only 3 of the 68 participants actually made it all 8 hours. For the 65 out of 68 that dropped out voluntarily at some point, again, this was a voluntary experiment, so basically kids could just sort of tap out and say, hey, you know, I'm done doing this at any time they wanted to. And then they just filled out a little questionnaire on why they stopped, how they felt throughout the experiment, all that stuff. So 3 of the kids made it to the end. 3 of the kids had suicidal thoughts during the time that they tried to complete the experiment. 5 of the kids experienced intense panic attacks. 27 experienced symptoms such as nausea, sweating, dizziness, hot flushes, or abdominal pain. And almost all of them experienced feelings of fear and anxiety. Many of the kids enjoyed the situation for the first or second hour when it was kind of still a novel and new thing, but by the second or third hour, these positive feelings started to go away. In only 10 of the 68 participants did they make it over 3 hours without feelings of anxiety starting to creep in. As bad as some of these symptoms sound, all the symptoms of stress disappeared immediately after the termination of the experiment. So, I think that it's really amazing that despite the fact that this is a small sample size, kids were equally likely to have suicidal thoughts as they were to actually make it to the end of 8 hours alone. This is the kind of experiment that just begs to see if it can be replicated by other researchers because it's such a shocking finding that it'd be interesting to know whether this study will hold up under scrutiny. But on the other hand, because it's making kids under the ages of 18 have suicidal thoughts, it might actually be kind of hard to get other ethics boards to agree to have the study be done again. So also really interesting, almost all of the participants, all of the kids tried to sleep at some point during their 8 hours, but none were able to because of the unusual thoughts going around and around in their heads. 6 of the kids who didn't make it the first time repeated the experiment on their own and claimed that on the second, third, or fifth time they managed to last the whole day without any serious problems. And 63 of the 68 agree that the experiment was useful, at least in terms of allowing them to learn something about themselves. I think this is fascinating. I tend to revel in things like long-distance plane flights where I can reliably count on having the world leave me alone for a while, but just another indicator of how much technology might really be affecting us, and particularly younger generations that have been growing up even more in a technologically and communication immersed environment, more so than we have at any time previously in history.
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, you heard it. That is the entire episode, number 114. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you liked what you heard here, please tell a couple of friends about Smart Drug Smarts. Pick an episode or two from our backlog and send along the link. All of our episodes actually can be found now by just typing in smartdrugsmarts.com/whatever the number is. So like episode number 12 is smartdrugsmarts.com/12, which makes it somewhat easier than the way that we had things organized before. Next week, we'll have an episode that's a little bit Valentine's-y in theme, thanks to the holiday that we've got coming up. I will not give away exactly what it is yet, but love potions may or may not be involved. So predictably, I will be back at you next Friday, same time, same podcast, and with that same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week until then, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.